Black history is narrative resistance against whitewashed memory and weaponized amnesia. Black history is narrative resistance against whitewashed memory and weaponized amnesia. I define narrative resistance this way. Narrative resistance is the deliberate act of telling the truth about history, power, and lived experience. When those in authority depend on distortion, silence, or myth to maintain control. Narrative resistance is the deliberate act of telling the truth about history, power, and lived experience when those in authority depend on distortion, silence, or myth to maintain control. And that is why, my friends, Black history is narrative resistance against whitewashed memory. So this episode is all about Black history versus whitewashed memory. I am your host, Dr. Jamar Tisby, and you are listening to The Justice Briefing. The Justice Briefing is your weekly guide to understanding current events through a faith-rooted, historically grounded, justice-centered lens. The best way to support me is to subscribe to my Substack, jamartisby.substack.com. If you want to invest in a Black historian doing Black history, become a paid subscriber at jamartisby.substack.com. It's just $7 a month. You will pay less than that when you go on your next coffee run. That costs less than your next coffee run. And $7 a month, you can make this work happen. And we can extend the work. Wouldn't it be cool if I did a live pop-up podcast in your city? If we went on a Justice Briefing live tour? That is where your investment goes, to support this work and to expand it. And this episode, I get to talk all about my favorite subject, Black history, with my favorite people, you folks tuning in. So it's going to be an incredible time. I promise you are going to learn a bunch that you didn't know this episode. You think you know all about Black history? We are going to dive into the Dunning School, which is a case study in whitewashed history. We're going to go into Carter G. Woodson, the organization he founded, the history of Black History Month. We're going to talk about how history is under attack under this regime and ways we can support accurate truth-telling about Black history. So stay tuned. Before we get into that, you'll notice, if you're watching my incredible ensemble, this new jacket is straight from Dublin, Ireland. I had the incredible opportunity to travel to Northern Ireland and Ireland. I went to Belfast to the Four Corners Festival, where I was able to give the closing talk of their festival, which is really important. So if you have any background in the history of Northern Ireland and Belfast, then you'll know about the Troubles, the 30-year-long violent paramilitary battles between British Protestants and Irish Catholics. Nearly 4,000 people killed in that time frame. Incredible hurt and pain along the way, as you would imagine. But in 1998 rather, they had this peace agreement and a cessation of hostilities, but it's still very tense there. And so the Four Corners Festival is a reconciliation, a peacemaking event to bring people back together at that. And so it was an incredible honor to be able to speak there. You can follow the Four Corners Festival on Instagram. It's just Four Corners Festival. I spoke about the spirit of justice and racial reconciliation because it was actually Racial Reconciliation Sunday. I talked about how I don't use that term racial reconciliation. I use the term racial justice. You'll be hearing more about that in the coming months. And incredible people there. So shout out to Miley and all the organizers of the event. I got to go with my friend and colleague Adam. We had a blast. We had a lot of Guinness. And then this is my second time to Belfast, but I had never made it to Dublin. So I got to go to Dublin, Ireland. That was an incredible few days. I went on the Guinness tour of the factory, of the brew house, and that was very well done. And in the gift shop, I found the marriage of these two wonderful institutions: Notre Dame, my alma mater, and Guinness, the beer there. So when I saw it, I just had to get it, and I'm wearing it today, representing for Notre Dame, for Guinness, for Ireland, for travel, for diversity, for reconciliation, for peacemaking, for all of that. So just wanted to give you a little bit of update on that. We are also entering our second week of the Justice Journey cohort. It's my live online course. Registration for this one is closed, but stay tuned. We're going to have a summer cohort of the Justice Journey, and you will hear more about that if you subscribe to jamartisby.substack.com. So let's dive into it. Have you ever heard of the Dunning School? The Dunning School is a school of historical thought that dominated in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And the reason why I bring up the Dunning School is because it is a case study in whitewashed memory. It is a case study in white supremacist, white male-dominated history. And it's a big reason, a representative reason, about why we need things like Black History and Black History Month. So before we dive into Black History Month, we got to understand this dominant historical narrative that actually shaped much of American memory for the 20th century. And you may have never heard of it, but you've definitely seen the impact and the effects of it. So first of all, this narrative was not neutral. All right. So here's my first little soapbox moment. There is the myth of objectivity. Objectivity, as a myth, serves the status quo. When it comes to historical memory, that status quo is white-centered and white-dominant. The myth of objectivity is simply to say that there's no objective way, purely objective way, to talk about history. First of all, no one would want to read just the facts of history. No one would want to read this happened and then this happened and then this happened and then this happened. And that's probably the way a lot of us learned history in school. It's the most boring way to do it. Rather, historians all have a perspective, even if they claim to be objective. That is, they're coming from a context. That context raises particular questions. Those are the questions that get studied in the archives and the primary source documents, and then you select information based on the questions that you have. And to go further, in the academic study of history, historians have an argument. They have a case they're trying to make, and so they marshal the evidence to make their case, their thesis. So, for example, in my first book, right here, The Color of Compromise, my argument is that the white church in the United States was complicit with racism more often than it confronted racism. And I give you a survey of 400 years of U.S. history with all kinds of examples to back up that thesis that the white church was complicit with racism much more often than it confronted racism. And people hated that thesis. There are some people so invested in whitewashed history that they gave the one-star reviews, they dragged me on their YouTube podcasts and their blogs. But whenever I encountered someone who didn't like the thesis, I'm like, cool, that's fine. You can have your own perspective, your own argument, your own hypothesis, but here's how it works. You have to marshal the evidence. And your evidence for your claim has to be more persuasive than my evidence for my claim. And whenever I presented that, I got crickets in response. Folks didn't have the historical facts, data, and evidence to refute my claim that more often white Christians in the United States were complicit with racism rather than confronting it. That's how history works, y'all. So it's this myth about objectivity. First of all, it's boring. Second of all, it's impossible because we all have a context. That context determines our questions. Those questions determine what information we look at, what information we leave in, what information we don't put in. And historians must offer a claim, an argument, a thesis, and then back that up with evidence. And to assert that history must be purely objective is not only an impossibility, but it serves the status quo. And in an academic discipline dominated by white men, many of them racist white men, that myth of objectivity only serves to perpetuate that whitewashed history. All right, that's my first soapbox. There's more to come. Now, as we go further, William Archibald Dunning. That's where we get the name, the Dunning School of History. It's named after him. So William Archibald Dunning's born in 1857 in Plainfield, New Jersey. He earned all three of his degrees, BA, MA, and PhD from Columbia University in New York. Not a small institution, not a minor institution, one of great reputation for rigor and academic excellence. This is where this racist, white supremacist school of history is being promulgated. So he taught at Columbia from the late 1880s until his death in 1922. So this man is an institution there. We're talking 40 plus years of teaching history at Columbia University. So you can imagine the thousands of students who came through his classes where he's teaching this whitewashed history that I'm about to tell you about. So imagine the impact, right? He was also a leading authority in the Reconstruction era, which is a pretty critical era when we're talking about black-white race relations. This is the era immediately following the Civil War, formally from 1865 to the Compromise of 1877. And he becomes this expert in it. He's also the president of the American Historical Association, the AHA, kind of the biggest game out there. AHA is in existence today. There's a huge annual conference, very prestigious. He's president of it in 1913, in the Jim Crow era. I'm just giving you a picture of how influential this man, William Archibald Dunning, is to the field of history. What you also need to know is that the field of history as an academic discipline is relatively new in this era. So it doesn't develop as a formal academic discipline really until the mid-19th, late 19th century. It starts becoming like something you can major in at school, something you can get a PhD in, something where there are scholars in, something that people devote their entire scholarly careers to. That has not always been the case. Yes, people have always sort of studied the past, looked back at the past, but as a field with standards and a guild and all of these hoops you got to jump through to be considered an expert or earn your doctorate, that is not that old. And William Archibald Dunning is coming in here sort of at the birth of the historical profession, historians as a profession, and he's massively influential in the infancy of this discipline. So even though you've never heard of that name, William Archibald Dunning perhaps, understand he is shaping the field of history as an academic discipline, and he is shaping literally generations of students, thousands upon thousands of students who encounter his work either in the classroom or through his books. So Dunning talks about Reconstruction in the most unhelpful of ways. You got to understand that even though this is how Brian Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, puts it, the North won the Civil War, the South won the narrative war. The North won the Civil War, the South won the narrative war. What does that mean? The Union won the military conflict of the Civil War. The Confederacy surrendered. But that doesn't mean the ethos of the Confederacy was defeated as well. The ethos of the Confederacy was pro-slavery. The underlying ideology of the Confederacy was white supremacy. I've written before multiple times about Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederate States of America. In his famous cornerstone speech, he says the cornerstone of the Confederacy is built upon the idea that white people are superior to black people, and therefore white men should rule and black people should be enslaved. He calls that the cornerstone of the Confederacy. Now, do you think that ideology just evaporated after the military conflict ended? No, of course not. Do you think that ideology went away in December 1865 when the Emancipation Proclamation, not the Emancipation Proclamation, when the 13th Amendment was passed? You think that just went away? Of course it didn't. Do you think it got better? Like fewer people believed it during the Reconstruction era, when black men were first allowed to vote, when black people were first considered citizens by birth, when black people first started holding political and elected office? Do you think people adhered to that ideology of white superiority more or less? There were many who clung to it even more tightly, which is why we have this era called Jim Crow. The reason I'm telling you this is because people who believed in white superiority had to come up with some kind of story to explain how the South lost the Civil War and how these 3.5 to 4 million now freed black people were actually doing amazing things, like building their own institutions, their own schools, their own colleges and universities, their own fraternities and sororities, their own churches and denominations, how they were winning elected office. This is the exact opposite of what people who believed in the inferiority of black people thought would happen. They thought, well, we need enslavement because without it, black people are going to be lazy and they're going to be prone to criminality and they're going to be a drain on society. That's what they said. And as soon as black people got free, with little to no help from anyone, it's not like we got reparations. We were given nothing but the legal emancipation. And with the little that we had, we built an entire culture and influenced the broader U.S. culture. And so if you are someone who believes in white superiority, how do you explain that? Enter men like William Archibald Dunning. So what he did, he framed Reconstruction as a tragic failure, a misguided attempt on the part of the federal government and Northerners to disrupt the Southern way of life, which, according to people like Dunning, was working just fine. Black people knew their place and they were happy. Why? Because they were cared for. They had jobs, they had clothing, they had productive work to do. That's how Dunning and his compatriots are framing history, in particular the history of black people. He claimed that Reconstruction had corrupted the South, that these Northerners and the federal government and these do-gooder white people had swept in, disrupted, and destroyed everything. They decimated the South physically through the Civil War, and they also decimated it socially and culturally. So it was a terrible blight on the South, is how Dunning taught that history. He portrayed black political participation as incompetent and dangerous. Well, yeah, sure, black people had won elected office, but they were uneducated, they were illiterate, they were not suited to lead, they couldn't function in a democracy, and when black people came into the political realm, that's what ruined everything. That's what Dunning taught. And this is in books, and this is in classroom, and this is in the ears of the United States' best and brightest college students. His work reflected and reinforced white racial anxieties and ideas of white racial supremacy. Just stoked those flames. And it was grounded in racist assumptions fundamentally. So he had trained, like I said, he'd trained generations of historians who then further spread this interpretation. And we see this cinematically in the 3-hour silent black and white film called Birth of a Nation, which is about the Reconstruction era and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And the way they characterize the Klan is as this noble group of people who came together reluctantly, but necessarily, with the inciting event of protecting a white woman's purity from the ravages of a black Union soldier. This is all depicted in the film Birth of a Nation. And so it's depicting white Ku Klux Klanners as the great, quote unquote, redeemers of the South, the people who came to restore the South to its honor and its nobility, and of course to protect white womanhood. That's the story that William Archibald Dunning is trying to reinforce with this veneer of academic seriousness in his work. And so his scholarship dominates early 20th century history. It shaped textbooks, it shaped classrooms, and like I said, it shaped popular culture. So if you've ever heard of terms like scalawag and carpetbagger, these are derogative terms. Carpetbaggers are northerners who came south they had carpets that they rolled up and put their possessions in. That's where the term carpetbagger came from. But again, these outside agitators is the idea behind how scalawags are southern white people who are like pro-black or at least pro-emancipation. They are seen as people who betray the South. Those terms become common through work like William Archibald Dunning's, and they're framing all of emancipation and all of black leadership as a mistake. And it's a narrative that was repeating itself and reverberating and being spread up through the 1960s, really. Up through the civil rights movement. And what's happening there is finally you have a group of historians who are like, actually, what we need to do is talk about the history that we've overlooked, the history that we've ignored. In particular, beginning in the 1960s, you get this turn in history to focus on race, class, and gender. Race, class, and gender. And so you have historians starting to talk more in depth in the academic sphere about Black history, about women's history, about labor history. And that begins to tell a very different story of U.S. history. It's also in this time, and in the 60s and into the 70s, that you get Black students, Black professors advocating for Black history. And this is when you start to get Black studies programs. This is when you start to get the formal subfield of Black history. There's U.S. history, and there's all these subfields like gender and labor history, and now you're getting Black history. That helps to spark other ones like Latin American history and Asian American history, and so on and so forth. So I'm emphasizing here the agency of Black people and of historians in forcing the issue to say we need to expand the lens beyond this whitewashed view of history. But the Dunning School had this massive impact. It gave academic legitimacy to white supremacist ideas. The Dunning School gave academic legitimacy to white supremacist ideas. It helped to justify segregation, voter disenfranchisement, the Jim Crow system as a whole, and it turned racial bias into so-called scholarly consensus. Told you we're going to learn something. So we have to start with things like the Dunning School to understand and appreciate the importance of Black history to refuting whitewash history, to understand the importance of narrative resistance, this deliberate act of truth-telling in the face of distortion, lies, and myths. So that brings us to a contemporary of William Archibald Dunning, another historian with a very different take on Black history. And that man is Carter G. Woodson. Of course, you've probably heard of Carter G. Woodson. He's very famously dubbed the father of Black history. You know, I'm just thinking about this, but when they talk about who do you want, who would you want to have dinner with, have a conversation with, anyone past or present, wouldn't Carter G. Woodson be interesting to have at that table? This is a man so dedicated to Black history that essentially he forces the nation to think about it differently. And he sets up traditions and institutions and publications to ensure that we are thinking deeply and wisely about Black history. And he wrote this book, The Miseducation of the Negro, which you may have heard of. I think it would be fascinating to talk to Carter G. Woodson. So let me tell you about Carter G. Woodson. He was born in 1875 and he died in 1950. He was the son of formerly enslaved parents. He didn't actually begin his formal education until he was almost 20 years old. He earned a high school diploma in West Virginia. Yes, there were Black people in West Virginia and are. His first undergraduate degree came from Berea College in Kentucky. Woo, woo. I live in Louisville, so. And then he got a bachelor's and a master's from the University of Chicago in just a few years. So once he got into a formal academic education system, the man was off and running. He was brilliant. And in 1912, the year before Dunning became president of the AHA, in 1912, Woodson became just the second African American to earn a PhD from Harvard University. So a few years later, Carter, Woodson, with this passion for Black history, founds an institution called the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. The Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. It is now called the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, or ASALH. That's the acronym, ASALH. If you go to asalh.org, asalh.org, you enter the time portal that is ASALH, a treasure trove of Black history, and particularly Black History Month. Carter G. Woodson founded what is now called ASALH, not just to celebrate Black history, but to correct the record. This is Black history versus whitewashed history. He wanted to share a history that had been omitted, distorted, and suppressed. This is Black history as narrative resistance. The oppressor doesn't get to narrate our existence. The oppressor doesn't get to narrate our existence. And Carter G. Woodson modeled that by starting an organization dedicated to celebrating and uplifting Black history, as well as correcting the whitewashed historical record. He didn't just do that. He also created in 1916 the Journal of Negro History and the Negro History Bulletin. The Journal of Negro History is now called the Journal of African American History. It is still being published to this day in conjunction with the University of Chicago. It's an extremely prestigious publication. If you're a scholar who gets published in the JAAH, that's a big honor. And Carter G. Woodson and his compatriots are to credit for that. The JAAH is the leading scholarly publication in the field of African American history. And of course, we know that Carter G. Woodson also started Negro History Week, which eventually becomes Black History Month. So if you don't know the story, In 1926, Woodson introduced Negro History Week. This is from the Asala website. He chose the month of February to honor the birthdays of two prominent abolitionists, Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, who both have birthdays in February. Now, there's a lot of controversy about Lincoln and, how pro-black or anti-slavery he was. But I think it's telling that in the middle of the Jim Crow era, in the 1920s, you have a black historian who recognizes the importance of Abraham Lincoln. However willingly or reluctantly, he led through the Civil War and signed the Emancipation Proclamation. At the end of the day, it was on his watch that black people finally got a chance at emancipation. And so I just think that's interesting. History is nuanced. History is complicated. No historical figure is exactly straightforward. They're a mix of good and bad. And yet when Woodson is choosing a month to honor black history, he chooses it at the conjunction of two people he considered abolitionists. Frederick Douglass, of course, who escaped into freedom and was later emancipated, was a black person, obviously, and Abraham Lincoln. And so also, correcting the record, a lot of people criticize February being Black History Month because it's the shortest month, 28 days most years. That wasn't really in Woodson's accounting. He was looking at what month could be historically significant in telling the history of black people, and he chose February. So there it is. And the holiday gained national recognition again in the 1960s when activists of the Civil Rights Movement brought Negro History Week to college campuses across the country. Now, this is an important fact for a couple of reasons. So, number one, I mentioned the historical turn to race, gender, and class in the 1960s. Well, right along with that, you are having the Civil Rights Movement and the growth in people paying attention to black history. So you have activists who are saying we need to know our past and forcing the issue. The other reason this is important, the timing here, is because of who was forcing the issue. Black college students. Black college students are saying, we want to know our history. We go to college and we get this whitewashed version of history. We hear all about these white men. And along with the Dunning School, which had this whitewashed view of history, it was also a very sexist view of history. So there's this school of history called the Great Man School of History, which studied history through the lens of so-called exceptional men, the presidents, the generals, the titans of industry, and not the so-called little people, not the grassroots people. So that is also happening here. And it's a way to say whose voices have been left out, whose perspectives haven't we studied or looked at or honored, and Black history is part of that. And I emphasize the fact that these are college students because I want young people to know you have a major role to play in progress, a major role to play in the shape of your college campuses and the courses and the academic study that you do. And it's because of college students that they actually got whole Black history departments, that they got a field called Black history, that they have books on Black history. And so young people have a really important role to play in shaping the narratives that we tell about the past and the present. So never overlook young people. And if you are a young person listening to this, never underestimate your place in history. Now, here's one of my passions, is that we understand that the Association for African American Life, for the Study of African American Life and History, are the curators of Black History Month. And as such, they come up with annual themes. I didn't even know this until grad school, until I'm well into adulthood. I didn't know there was actually an official theme for Black History Month, nor who produced it. So shout out to Asala. And as we talk about honoring Black History Month, donate to this group, become a member in this group, pay your dues, and certainly spread the knowledge. They have all these wonderful downloadable graphics and these magazines and bulletins and information galore about Carter G. Woodson, about the association itself, about Black History Month. And I just think it's really powerful. It's also really, really not good that we don't vocally give attribution to Asala more often. These are the originators of Black History Month, and they are the curators of Black History Month, and they have these themes every year, and yet no one mentions Asala in the popular discourse. Most people have never even heard of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, much less understand what they do. So, if you want to be part of the solution, at least give credit where credit is due. H.org. Visit the website, learn all about their work, and here are the themes. So, they've had a few themes over the years. I mean, they come up with a theme every year. So here's an example of their themes. 2023, the theme was Black Resistance. 2024, African Americans and the Arts. 2025, African Americans and labor. They even have themes for the future. So if you want to plan for 2027, drum roll. The theme for 2027 is From Black Print Culture to Digital Blackness. From Black Print Culture to Digital Blackness. If you want to know what the heck that means or how to delve into that history, go to the website, asalh.org, and it has an explainer for each of the themes. So you know exactly what to highlight, what to emphasize, what to share, and to whom to give credit. Now, I'm going to tell you about the 2026 theme, the year we're in. But before that, I want to share a quote by W.E.B. Du Bois, who himself did a monumental work of history in this doorstopper of a book called Black Reconstruction. I'll try to find the exact quote, but I love in the preface to the book, he basically says, there are some people who will read this book and fundamentally believe in the inferiority of Black people. And Du Bois basically says, this book ain't for you. But he says to other people, if you are willing to give Black people a fair shake and treat them as equal human beings, then it's going to be productive for you to read this book. But he just goes right to the heart of it and says, look, if you're a white supremacist, racist, you aren't going to agree with anything I'm writing in this book. But if you can take for granted that Black people are human beings on par with anyone and everyone else, then buckle up, because you're going to learn a whole lot. So that Du Bois is speaking about Carter G. Woodson in this quote. He says, Woodson literally made this country recognize and celebrate each year a week in which it is studied the effect which the American Negro has had upon the life, thought, and action of the United States. I know of no other man who in a lifetime has unaided built up such a national celebration. High praise from the first Black graduate PhD from Harvard University to the second Black PhD graduate from Harvard University, Du Bois talking about Carter G. Woodson. So the 2026 theme is very significant. The 2026 theme coming from the Association for the Study of African American Life and History is this: a century of Black history commemorations. A century of Black history commemorations. So, Carter G. Woodson and his organization celebrated the first Negro History Week back in 1926. That makes 2026 100 years of Black history commemorations. Happy anniversary to Black History Month. Of course, it wasn't always Black History Month. That came later. But 100 years, happy anniversary of commemorating Black history in this formal, organized way. So it's an important year. Also happens to be the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So isn't that an interesting juxtaposition? That you have the nation's birthday, 250th birthday, in the same year as you have the 100th anniversary of Black history commemorations. I want to go back 50 years to 1976. I just found out about this not long ago, and I may write about it, but I want to share it with you on this podcast, the Justice Briefing. So on February 10th, 1976, during the United States bicentennial, so 1976 is the nation's 200th anniversary. 2026 is 250th, 50 years ago, the nation's 200th anniversary. The president at the time, Gerald R. Ford, Republican, officially recognized Black History Month. And he urged Americans to, quote, seize the opportunity to honor the too often neglected accomplishments of Black Americans. That recognition expanded Black History Week into Black History Month. So wasn't until 50 years in that there was some sort of official, nationally recognized Black history commemoration. And in doing so, it was expanded from Black History Week to Black History Month. Now, that didn't make it official. That was simply a recognition. Black folks wanted the president to officially declare February Black History Month. That came later in 1986. Congress passed a joint resolution officially designating February as National Black History Month. So the actual designation, the actual formal commemoration and resolution, that wasn't until 1986. So this is relatively recent history, right? 10 years after Gerald R. Ford first, from the president's perch, recognized Black History Month. But it's significant. And here is the contrast. 50 years ago, you had a Republican president in Gerald R. Ford saying, not only do we need to recognize and commemorate Black history, we need to expand the commemoration from 1 week to a whole month. Uplifting Black history. He said we need to recognize the important contribution made to our nation's life and culture by Black citizens. 50 years later, you have another Republican president, Donald J. Trump, who is leading the charge to re-whitewash history. He issued this executive order that said all the Smithsonian institutions and National Park Service institutions, they had to have their exhibits and displays scrutinized for so-called anti-American sentiment. What that looks like in practice is recently, National Park Service officials were ordered to take down panels that talked about the lives of the people who President George Washington enslaved. Now, why would you want to take down those panels? Because you want to literally whitewash history. The nation's first president enslaving people, that's not a good look. Because this regime wants to paint a national picture of the past that portrays the United States as purely virtuous and noble, and even where it failed, it learned from its mistakes and made progress. wants to ignore the fact that a majority of the nation's first presidents were enslavers, that the majority of people signing the Declaration and the Constitution, enslaved people, doesn't want to look head on at this nation's racist past, this nation built on the land theft and genocide of indigenous people based on the exploited labor through race-based chattel slavery of African-descended people. So Black history versus whitewashed history is not just a battle of the past. It is a constant struggle. And here you have this contrast of two presidents, Gerald R. Ford and Donald J. Trump. 50 years ago, we have a Republican president uplifting Black history and expanding its commemoration. 50 years later, you have a Republican president whitewashing history and erasing Black contributions. This is a momentous Black History Month, not to mention the fact that it's the 100th anniversary of Black history commemorations. I told you were going to learn something. Y'all don't believe me. So I want to bring this to a close, and I want to emphasize that Black history versus whitewash history is about whose voices are heard. It's about whose voices are heard. When we look at the shifts in the academic study of history, it's mainly about bringing more voices in. By the way, no one is voiceless. Everyone has a voice. The question is, whose voices are heard and whose voices are muted? Whose voices do we turn up the volume knob and whose voices do we turn it down? But everyone has a voice because everyone's experience and perspective and lives matter. And so history, the responsible study of history, is about making sure that voices that have been historically muted and marginalized actually have a say in the historical record. So Black history exists because this whitewash history masquerades as scholarship, as in the Dunning School. We need Black history because men with credentials, academic credentials, and institutional power told versions of history, like the history of Reconstruction, that made Black freedom look like a mistake and white backlash look like redemption. Silence is never neutral. History is never neutral. Objectivity is not even a virtue, much less possible, because so-called objectivity stays silent about the whitewashing of the past, and it reinforces the status quo. William Archibald Dunning and his intellectual descendants turned racial bias into so-called scholarly consensus. They weren't just writing history. They were shaping the nation's moral imagination. And it took men like Carter G. Woodson and generations of Black scholars, teachers, pastors, journalists, hobbyists, organizers to say that's not the whole story. That's not the correct record. That's not the truth. They had to practice narrative resistance so the oppressor would not narrate their reality. Black History Month isn't about nostalgia. It's not about diversity programming. It's narrative resistance. It is a refusal of whitewashed memory and weaponized amnesia. Black history is a rejection of the lie that Black political leadership was incompetent. It's a rejection of the myth that Jim Crow was inevitable. And it expands whose voices are heard and whose lives are valued. When we tell the truth, we are not just correcting the past. We are shaping the future. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Justice Briefing, Black History versus Whitewashed Memory. If you want more information like this, then support at jamartisby.substack.com. I will see you on the next episode of the Justice Briefing.